When I first took the job as a park ranger, it seemed like a dream come true. I had always loved the outdoors, the sense of freedom and peace that came with being surrounded by nature. The idea of spending my days and nights looking after a vast expanse of forest sounded perfect. But that was before I learned about Fire Tower 16. Tower 16 had a reputation. It wasn't one that was talked about openly, but when I was assigned to it, the older rangers gave me a look, a mix of pity and concern. They didn't say much, just mumbled something about it being a tough post. But I could see the unease in their eyes, the way they avoided the topic. I thought they were just trying to spook the new guy, test my mettle. I was wrong. My first night at Tower 16 started like any other. I arrived just before dusk, the sun sinking low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the trees. The tower itself was an old wooden structure that creaked with every gust of wind. It stood tall and imposing, overlooking the dense forest below, a solitary sentinel in the wilderness. As I climbed the narrow staircase to the top, I felt a strange sense of anticipation mixed with a hint of dread. The higher I went, the more isolated I felt, as if the world below was slipping away, leaving me alone with the night. By the time I reached the small cabin at the top, the sun had disappeared completely, and the forest was shrouded in darkness. The cabin was simple, just a desk, a chair, a bed, and the array of equipment needed to monitor the forest for signs of fire. The walls were covered in maps and charts, and there was a large window that offered a panoramic view of the forest below. As I settled in for the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even though I knew I was miles away from the nearest human being. The first few hours were uneventful. I busied myself with checking the equipment, making sure everything was in working order. The forest was quiet, the only sounds the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. But as the night wore on, the atmosphere began to change. The air grew colder, and the wind picked up, howling through the trees like a mournful wail. It was then that I heard it, the sound of footsteps on the stairs below. At first I thought I was imagining it. I strained to listen, but the wind was so loud that it was hard to be sure. But then, there it was again, a distinct creak of wood, followed by another, closer this time. Someone, or something, was climbing the stairs. I grabbed the flashlight from the desk, my heart pounding in my chest. I pointed the beam down the staircase, but there was nothing there, just the empty steps winding down into the darkness. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment the only sound was the blood rushing in my ears. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking slightly. "Is someone there?" No answer, just the wind whistling through the gaps in the wooden walls. I waited, listening intently, but the footsteps didn't return. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was just the wind playing tricks on me, and I tried to push the incident out of my mind. But as the night wore on, the strange occurrences only increased. Every so often I would hear the footsteps again, always faint, always just out of sight. Sometimes they seemed to come from directly beneath the cabin, as if someone was walking in circles around the base of the tower. Other times, they seemed to ascend the stairs, stopping just before reaching the top. Then there were the screams. They started around midnight, distant at first, barely audible over the wind. But as the hours passed, they grew louder, more desperate, echoing through the forest like the cries of someone in terrible pain. I tried to pinpoint their source, but they seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, carried on the wind from all directions. I radioed into the main station, hoping someone could help me make sense of what I was hearing. But the response was static-filled and garbled, the voices on the other end distorted and unintelligible. The connection was bad, probably due to the storm that was now raging outside, and I couldn't get through. I was alone. By 3 a.m., I was on edge, jumping at every sound, every flicker of movement in the shadows. I couldn't see anything unusual from the windows, just the dark expanse of forest stretching out below, illuminated only by the occasional flash of lightning. But I could feel something, an oppressive presence that seemed to hang in the air, thick and heavy, like the calm before a storm. And then I saw them. At first, they were just shadows, moving between the trees, barely visible against the darkness of the forest. But as I watched, they grew more distinct, taking on the shapes of tall, thin figures, their outlines blurred and indistinct. They moved slowly, deliberately, weaving between the trees, always just at the edge of the light. I tried to focus on them, to get a better look, but every time I did, they seemed to vanish, dissolving into the darkness like smoke. But I knew they were there. I could feel their eyes on me, cold and unblinking, watching my every move. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, staring out at the forest. Time seemed to stretch, each minute dragging on for an eternity. The footsteps continued, echoing through the tower, growing louder and more insistent, until it felt like they were right behind me. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the flashlight and rushed down the stairs, determined to confront whatever was out there, to prove to myself that it was all in my head. But as I reached the bottom of the tower, the footsteps stopped abruptly, and the forest fell silent. I swept the flashlight around the base of the tower, the beam cutting through the darkness. The wind had died down, and the air was still, too still. The shadows between the trees seemed to shift and swirl, and for a moment, I thought I saw something tall and pale, standing just beyond the reach of the light. But when I turned the flashlight towards it, there was nothing there. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring into the darkness, waiting for something, anything to happen. But the shadows remained still, and the forest was silent. Eventually, I forced myself to return to the cabin, though every fiber of my being screamed at me to run, to get as far away from that place as possible. The rest of the night passed in a haze. I sat at the desk, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline, my eyes fixed on the window. The shadows outside continued to move, shifting and twisting in the darkness, but they never came any closer. The footsteps returned occasionally, always stopping just before reaching the top of the stairs, as if taunting me, daring me to come out and face them. When dawn finally broke, the first light of morning creeping over the horizon, the shadows melted away, and the forest returned to its normal, peaceful state. The wind died down, the birds began to sing, and the screams and footsteps vanished, leaving only an eerie silence in their wake. I stayed in the tower until my shift ended, too shaken to move. When the next ranger arrived to relieve me, I didn't say anything about what had happened. I just nodded and left, eager to put as much distance between myself and Tower 16 as possible. But the experience haunted me. I couldn't stop thinking about the shadows, the footsteps, the screams. I began to research the history of the tower, hoping to find some explanation for what I had experienced. What I found only deepened my fear. Tower 16 had a long and troubled history. Over the years, several rangers had worked there, all of them assigned to the night shift. Some had disappeared without a trace, their bodies never found. Others had been found dead, their faces frozen in expressions of terror with no signs of what had killed them. A few had survived, but they were never the same, driven mad by whatever they had encountered in the tower. The stories were all eerily similar, strange noises, shadowy figures, a sense of being watched, but no one had ever been able to explain what was causing the phenomena. Some speculated that the tower was built on cursed land, a place where the boundary between our world and something darker and more ancient was thin. Others believed that the tower itself was a beacon, drawing in malevolent spirits from the forest. I tried to put it all out of my mind, to tell myself that it was just an old building with a creepy history, that there was no such thing as ghosts or curses. But deep down, I knew that what I had experienced was real, too real to be dismissed as a trick of the mind. Against my better judgment, I returned to Tower 16. I needed answers, needed to understand what was happening. The next few nights were uneventful, almost peaceful. I began to think that maybe it had all been in my head, that I had let the stories and the isolation get to me. But then on the fourth night, it started again. The footsteps, the screams, the shadows, they all returned, more intense than before. The air grew thick with an oppressive weight, and I felt a presence, something ancient and evil, pressing in on me from all sides. The tower seemed to vibrate with energy, as if it were alive, pulsating with some dark force. And then I saw it, something that I will never forget. It was just after midnight when the footsteps reached the top of the stairs. This time they didn't stop. They kept coming, growing louder and louder, until they were right outside the cabin door. The door, which had been securely locked, began to rattle on its hinges, as if something was trying to force its way in. I backed away, my heart pounding, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The door burst open with a deafening crash and the figure stepped inside. It was tall and thin, its body draped in shadows, its face hidden in darkness. But its eyes, those eyes, glowed with a cold, malevolent light, burning into me with an intensity that froze me in place. It reached out a hand, long and skeletal, and I felt a wave of despair wash over me, as if all the hope and light in the world had been drained away. I don't remember what happened next. I must have passed out because when I came to, the figure was gone, and the sun was rising in the sky. The door was hanging off its hinges, the wood splintered and broken. I stumbled down the stairs, barely able to stand, and made my way back to the main station. I never returned to Tower 16 after that night. I resigned from the job and left the area, unable to shake the feeling that something had followed me, that it was still watching, waiting for me to return. I've tried to move on, to forget what happened, but the memories linger, haunting me every time I close my eyes. I don't know what I saw in that tower, what ancient evil I encountered, but I do know one thing. Tower 16 is cursed, a beacon for something dark and malevolent that dwells in the forest, and those who watch over it at night are doomed to face the terror that lies within.